Greetings and welcome to another lecture in statistics. Now, in this particular chapter, we're covering ANOVAs, or analysis of variance. Now, we're just going to focus on a one-way analysis of variance here, because when you start getting into the two-way, it starts to get more complicated and have a lot more math involved, which when you have computers to be able to do it makes a lot more sense. But since this is a by hand with the help of a calculator class, we're just going to stick with the one way. Once you understand the one way, then you can hopefully understand more as you sort of move on into more complexity. I also want to point out that this chapter, even though we're only doing one-way ANOVAs, is quite complicated enough. We're going to be diving very deep into a lot of math. You're going to be doing in future videos a whole lot of stopping and starting to make sure that you have everything written down. So this video is just going to be kind of an introduction as to why we would use an ANOVA instead of some of the other tests that we've already talked about. So let's get this going. Why are we going to use this particular test? Well, what we've been talking about before, when we've either been comparing a sample mean to the population mean, or we've been comparing two sample means basically to each other. And so what we're going to be doing with ANOVAs, or analysis of variance, is looking at research at the results that involve three or more means, three or more groups of samples, three or more groups of cases. And all of these have the same variable being measured for each. Now, that's a one-way. A two-way is when you have two variables being measured for each and so forth. And so, yeah, it gets more complicated. So we're just going to stick with one. We're going to keep it simple. Although when you see the next videos, you may disagree with that. Keep it as simple as possible. So it is possible, if you have three or more treatment groups, to do t-tests. But the problem with doing t-tests is that you have to compare all the possible combinations, which basically means that if you have three treatment groups, you're going to be doing, you're going to be doing three different ANOVAs, or three different t-tests, let's say. But once you get to 4, then you suddenly jump up to 6 different, and when you get to 5 different groups, then oh my god, I mean it gets very, very hard very, very quickly. And it's much easier to do one ANOVA than it is to do a whole bunch of those particular t-tests. So what do these tests look at? The big comparison here is whether there's more variance between the three or more groups than there is within each group. This is an analysis of variance, so we're looking at the variance, how much the scores vary around the mean. And we're looking at whether or not there's more variance between than within. A way to think about it is on the next slide. These particular diagrams are also in your textbook. If you look at the upper left-hand corner, you will see the performance in 3 different learning environments. That's what both of these are on. These are hypothetical experiments. In the one in the upper left-hand corner, the means are relatively close together, and the ranges for each of these groups overlap a lot. A overlaps a lot with B and not a little bit with C, and B overlaps considerably with both A and C. And see, I mean, you get the idea. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of variance within each group. And in fact, if you compare the range within each group to the difference between the means, you'll notice that the range in each group, the variance within the groups, is a lot more than the difference between the means of each group. So this has a lot of variance, and the variance within each group is much larger than the variance between. So the odds are that the differences are probably not, due to some inherent difference between the groups. There's way too much overlap for that. Any difference that you see may well be due to chance, or may well be due to differences that are very, very small. But when you look down at the lower right-hand corner, you will notice that there's not a lot of variance within the groups. The range within the groups is smaller compared to the difference between the means. If we look at the range of A, smallest to largest, it's actually smaller, or I think it's smaller, I'm not actually measuring it, it's smaller, let's say, than the difference between the means of A and B. So there's more variance between the groups, between A and B, for instance, than there is variance within A, or within B, or within C. And that's not even talking about the variance between A and C. So in this case, there's almost certainly something with that independent variable, where the schooling is taking place, what the learning environment is, that is causing a significant difference in the scores. And what ANOVAs do is they tell us whether we have figure 10.1 or whether we have figure 10.2, whether there is a significant difference between the means, more variance between the means than within each group, or whether there is more difference within each group than between the means. And much of the rest of this chapter, we're going to talk about within groups versus between groups. Within groups is how much is going on within that particular group. Between groups is what's going on between group A and group B. Make sure that you get this, the difference between within and between. Within is within a particular group like group A. Between is comparing two groups like group A compared to B, or A compared to C, or B compared to C. Make sure you got that before you move on, because the whole rest of this chapter is talking about within groups and between groups and doing things differently and so forth. So it's a really good idea to make sure you got that before you move on.